The sun barely crested the horizon when I heard the sound of tires crunching on gravel. Not the deep, rolling kind you'd expect from a rancher's truck, but the whiny, delicate sound of a compact crossover, the type that belonged in a grocery store parking lot, not on my land. I set my coffee down, wiped my hands on my jeans, and stepped off my porch just in time to see a trio of people in matching polo shirts marching toward me like they owned the place. One woman, mid-50s with a haircut so sharp it looked like it could slice through steel, led the charge. She was flanked by two sidekicks. One, a wiry man with the kind of perfectly gelled hair that had probably never known a hard day's work, and the other, a woman clutching a clipboard like it was a legal weapon. I already knew this wasn't going to be a neighborly visit. Before I could ask what they wanted, the lead woman extended a hand she had no intention of letting me shake. "Good morning, Mr. Walker. I'm Karen Whitmore, president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. This is my vice president, Brad Peterson, and our community compliance officer, Susan Martinez. We've sent you multiple notices regarding your violations, but since you haven't responded, we're here to conduct an official assessment." She smiled like she'd just handed me a winning lottery ticket instead of an unsolicited problem. I stared at her for a beat, then shifted my eyes to her crew, noting their matching embroidered shirts and laminated name badges swinging from their neck. The absurdity of it nearly made me laugh. Instead, I took a slow, measured breath and said, "I'm not part of your HOA." Karen's smile didn't falter. "Oh, we're aware. However, per our community bylaws, any property within 2 miles of Whispering Pines that may visually impact the neighborhood's aesthetic value falls under our jurisdiction for compliance." I blinked. Slowly. Then, just to make sure I wasn't still half asleep, I asked, "You're telling me you think my ranch, which has been here for 3 generations, somehow needs to follow the rules of a suburban HOA I never joined?" Brad, the younger guy, stepped forward and puffed out his chest like he was about to educate me. "It's about maintaining property values. You have unapproved livestock, outdated fencing, and," he waved his hand vaguely toward my barn, "multiple unregistered outbuildings that don't conform to HOA standards." I let out a long, slow whistle and rubbed my chin. "Unapproved livestock. You mean my cattle?" "Correct. The cattle I raise to sell beef." "Yes, sir," Susan chimed in, adjusting her clipboard. "Our concern is that the smell, noise, and general appearance of livestock can have a negative impact on the community's atmosphere." I exhaled hard and crossed my arms. "Did it ever occur to you that this ranch was here long before your community even existed?" Karen's smile finally thinned, revealing the steel underneath. "We're not here to debate history, Mr. Walker. We're here to ensure compliance." She tapped her tablet and held it up so I could see a list of violations, fines attached to each one. "If you refuse to cooperate, we'll have no choice but to escalate this through legal channels." I didn't say anything at first. I just stood there, staring at them, the absurdity of the moment pressing down like a weight. They really thought they could waltz onto my land, threaten me with meaningless fines, and I'd just roll over? I looked past them toward the neat rows of identical houses lined up at the edge of my property, cookie-cutter homes with pristine lawns and cars parked so uniformly you'd think they were placed there by a machine. It was like a different world, one that had crept too close to mine. With a deep sigh, I pulled out my phone and started dialing. Karen's eyes narrowed. "Who are you calling?" "The sheriff." Brad stiffened. Now, there's no need for that." I held up a hand, cutting him off. "Sheriff Roberts?" "Yeah, it's Walker. Got a few folks on my land claiming they have the authority to fine me for having cows. You mind swinging by?" I paused, staring Karen dead in the eye. "Yeah, they're still here." Karen's face turned a lovely shade of red, but she didn't move. Neither did Brad or Susan. It was almost impressive. Either they were really committed to their nonsense, or they thought I was bluffing. Either way, they were about to find out exactly how serious I was. 15 minutes later, the familiar sound of a patrol car rolling up the driveway sent a ripple of unease through the HOA trio. Sheriff Roberts stepped out, his sunglasses reflecting the early morning sun, and adjusted his belt as he approached. He looked from me to the three suburban warriors and sighed like a man who'd seen too much stupidity for one lifetime. "What's going on here?" Karen, to her credit, recovered fast. "Sheriff, I'm Karen Whitmore, president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. We're here conducting a compliance inspection." Roberts arched an eyebrow and turned to me. "Inspection for what?" "They think my ranch falls under their HOA," I said, voice as dry as the dust at our feet. Roberts took a slow breath through his nose, then let it out, long and exasperated. "Miss Whitmore, let me make this real simple. Mr. Walker's property is not, and never has been, part of your HOA. That means you have no authority here. None." Karen's jaw tightened. "But, Sheriff, our bylaws clearly state—" "I don't care what your bylaws say," Roberts interrupted, adjusting his sunglasses. "What I care about is trespassing. And right now, you and your committee are standing on private property without permission." He shifted his gaze to Brad and Susan. "That's a criminal offense in this county." Brad swallowed hard. Susan clutched her clipboard like a lifeline. Karen, however, wasn't ready to surrender. "We're simply trying to uphold community standards." Roberts pulled a small notebook from his pocket and flipped it open. "You're trying to enforce rules that don't apply here. If Mr. Walker tells you to leave and you refuse, I'll have no choice but to arrest you for trespassing." Silence stretched between us. Karen's lips pressed into a thin line, her face twitching like she was physically restraining herself from arguing. Finally, she forced a smile, though it looked more like she'd bitten into a lemon. "This isn't over, Mr. Walker." I grinned. "Looking forward to it." They turned and walked back to their car, but not before Karen took a final picture of my barn, like it was some kind of crime scene. The moment they were gone, Sheriff Roberts shook his head and muttered, "Jesus, these people." I chuckled. "They really think they can make me follow their rules?" Roberts clapped a hand on my shoulder. "Welcome to the modern world, Walker. HOAs like that don't know when to quit." I exhaled, watching the tail lights of their little SUV fade into the distance. Something told me this was only the beginning. A week passed and I thought maybe, just maybe, common sense had won. Maybe Karen and her clipboard warriors had finally understood the concept of private property and moved on to harass someone else about the height of their hedges or the shade of their mailbox. But, of course, that would have been too easy. The first sign that the war wasn't over came in the form of a thick envelope stuffed into my mailbox, even though I lived too far out for standard postal delivery, and the only people who ever came down my driveway were those who had business being there. It was stamped with the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association logo, which at this point, I was convinced was designed in the pits of hell. I opened it at my kitchen table, taking a long sip of coffee as I scanned through the ridiculousness inside. A formal citation for property violations, listing everything from unauthorized livestock to disruptive aesthetic elements, which I could only assume referred to my barn, my tractor, or maybe even my actual existence. Then there was a bill. $5,000 in accumulated fines for noncompliance, with a threat of legal action if I didn't submit payment within 30 days. I laughed out loud, the sound echoing in the quiet of my kitchen. These people had lost their damn minds. I picked up my phone and dialed Jim Davidson, my lawyer, who had been handling my family's legal matters for years. As soon as he picked up, I read the letter to him, pausing occasionally to let the sheer stupidity of it sink in. By the time I finished, there was a long silence on the other end before Jim finally exhaled. "They sent you a fine? For not following rules that don't apply to you?" I leaned back in my chair, still holding the letter. "That about sums it up." Jim chuckled, but there was a sharpness to it. "Oh, they're in for a rude awakening. Ignore it for now, but save that letter. If they push this, we'll push back harder." I didn't doubt him for a second. Jim had taken down corporations before. An overzealous HOA would be nothing more than an afternoon workout for him. I figured that would be the end of it, but again, I had underestimated just how far these people were willing to go. 2 days later, I woke up to find bright orange violation notices stapled to my fence posts along the property line. Big, bold letters screamed at me about livestock restrictions, fencing ordinances, and community decorum policies. The absurdity of it would have been funny if I wasn't already tired of their nonsense. I yanked one off the fence, shaking my head. But it got worse. That afternoon, I caught 2 HOA board members standing just inside my property line, snapping pictures of my cattle like they were gathering evidence for some twisted suburban courtroom drama. I walked up to them, my boots crunching in the dirt, and they had the audacity to act like they belonged there. One of them, a lanky man with a perpetual sneer, held up his phone like he was documenting a crime scene. "Sir, we're collecting proof of your ongoing violations. Your cattle are not compliant with Whispering Pines livestock policies." I tilted my head, genuinely baffled. "You do realize you're standing on my land right now, right?" The other man, shorter but with an equally punchable face, cleared his throat. "We have the right to enforce community standards." I stared at them for a long moment, then turned and pointed toward the road. "Get off my property." They hesitated just long enough for me to pull out my phone. "If you're still here when I look up from dialing the sheriff, you're getting arrested for trespassing." That sent them scurrying, but I wasn't done. I installed security cameras along my fence line and put up fresh no trespassing signs every 50 feet. But they still weren't finished. A few days later, just as I was finishing repairs on a section of fence, I heard the unmistakable hum of a golf cart approaching from the direction of Whispering Pines. I turned just in time to see Karen herself, along with 2 of her minions, rolling onto my land like she was surveying her kingdom. The golf cart bounced unevenly on the dirt, looking completely out of place against the backdrop of my ranch. As they approached, my cattle, usually unbothered by most things, started shifting nervously. A few even backed away, their ears twitching. I knew why a second later. The golf cart's engine, unfamiliar and obnoxiously high-pitched, was spooking them. "Oh, hell no," I muttered under my breath as I started toward them. But before I could reach them, the worst happened. The cattle nearest to the fence, already on edge, suddenly bolted, spooking the rest into a full-on stampede away from the noise. I cursed as I watched several of them plow straight through the section of fence I had just repaired, tearing it apart like it was made of paper. My gut twisted as I realized that this wasn't just a minor inconvenience. This was actual damage, real consequences, all because these idiots thought they had some kind of authority over my land. Karen, for once, looked startled. "Oh dear," she muttered, glancing between me and the destruction her little joyride had just caused. "I suppose we should discuss the fence repairs?" My hands curled into fists at my sides. "No. What you should do is get off my land before I have you arrested for property damage." The man sitting next to her had the nerve to scoff. "That seems a little extreme." I took a slow step forward, making sure they could see just how unamused I was. "I don't think you understand. You just caused thousands of dollars in damage to my fence. You scared my cattle. You trespassed. And you've been harassing me for weeks. I've been patient, but I'm done playing nice." Karen, ever the arrogant one, lifted her chin. "Mr. Walker, there's no need for hostility. We're simply enforcing." I pulled out my phone and held it up so they could see the screen. "Do you know what this is? It's security footage of you trespassing, of you disturbing my livestock, of you breaking my property. And do you know who's going to see it next? My lawyer. Followed by a judge." That finally shut them up. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no words came out. The man beside her swallowed hard, glancing nervously toward the road. We should probably go," the woman in the back whispered. Without another word, Karen slammed the golf cart into reverse, spinning it around so fast it nearly tipped over before they sped off in a cloud of dust. I let out a slow breath and turned to assess the damage. The fence was wrecked. The cattle would have to be rounded up. hours of work ahead, all because of a group of people who couldn't accept that they didn't own everything in sight. I called Jim that night, filled him in on what happened, and sent him the security footage. He didn't even let me finish before he said, "We're suing them. No more warnings. No more patience. This is harassment, property damage, and criminal trespassing. We're going to hit them where it hurts." And that's when I knew this wasn't just about me anymore. This was about setting a precedent, about showing these HOA bullies that they couldn't trample over people just because they felt entitled to do so. They wanted a war? Fine. They had just started one. The lawsuit hit the HOA board like a sledgehammer to the chest. Karen and her cronies had been expecting me to either back down or throw some half-hearted complaint their way, not go nuclear with a full-scale legal battle backed by a lawyer with a reputation for eating bureaucrats alive. Jim wasted no time filing for a restraining order, a cease and desist order, and a formal lawsuit for harassment, property damage, and criminal trespassing. It wasn't just about the damages to my fence or the time and money I had to spend rounding up my cattle. It was about setting the record straight and making sure these people learned their lesson in a way they wouldn't forget. Jim made it clear from the start that we weren't just aiming for a slap on the wrist. He was going for the jugular, pushing for punitive damages that would hit them right where it hurt most: their precious HOA budget. Karen tried to act unfazed at first, even sending me one last letter warning that I was overreacting and that legal action would only result in unnecessary expenses for both parties. I laughed when I read that part, because it wasn't going to cost me a damn thing. Jim was handling it all on contingency, meaning he wouldn't get paid unless we won. And he wasn't the kind of lawyer who lost. The day of the hearing arrived with a storm hanging low in the sky, the kind of thick gray clouds that promised thunder before the day was done. I wore my best jeans, a pressed button-down, and my well-worn boots, while Karen and her crew showed up in stiff business suits that looked completely out of place in a rural courthouse. She had hired some fancy lawyer from the city, a man who looked like he charged by the breath and reeked of overconfidence. He stood when the judge entered, straightening his tie like he was about to argue some high-profile case instead of an HOA's failed power trip. Jim barely even glanced at him, too busy organizing the stack of evidence he'd gathered over the past month. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Judge Martinez, wasted no time getting to the heart of the matter. She listened as Karen's lawyer tried to spin the story, painting the HOA as a group of concerned citizens merely trying to uphold community standards, and that I was, apparently, an aggressive landowner refusing to comply with reasonable expectations. He droned on about property values, aesthetic standards, and the need for cohesion within adjacent communities. I nearly laughed out loud when he mentioned that last part, considering the only thing his clients had managed to unify was my growing hatred for their nonsense. Then Jim stood up and everything changed. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He went straight for the throat, laying out the facts in such an unflinching, methodical way that even I was impressed. He presented the history of my ranch, complete with official records proving that my land had been in agricultural use long before Whispering Pines even existed. He played security footage of the HOA trespassing, plastering violation notices on my property, and worst of all, the incident with the golf cart that had spooked my cattle and caused actual damage. The courtroom was dead silent as the footage played, the screen showing Karen gripping the steering wheel while her two minions laughed, completely unaware that their little stunt was about to cost them dearly. Jim then introduced the letters, the fines, the official documents filled with threats and legal jargon meant to intimidate me into submission. He compared their so-called authority with the actual laws governing property rights in the state, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the HOA had absolutely no jurisdiction over my land. And then, just when it seemed like he was wrapping up, he delivered the final blow. "Your Honor, we're not just asking for damages. We're asking for punitive action. The HOA's repeated, deliberate harassment isn't just an inconvenience. It's a direct attack on property rights and a blatant misuse of authority. These actions weren't accidental. They were calculated. This isn't about community standard. This is about control. He turned to face Karen, who sat stiff-backed in her chair, her lips pressed so tightly together they looked bloodless. This board abused its position, ignored clear legal boundaries, and caused real financial harm to my client. And they did it knowingly. The judge took a long pause before speaking, her gaze sweeping over the room like she was weighing every argument, every piece of evidence, before delivering her verdict. Then she looked at Karen and the HOA board with an expression that could have turned steel into dust. Mrs. Whitmore, your HOA's authority does not extend beyond the properties within its membership. Your attempts to fine, regulate, and threaten Mr. Walker were not just inappropriate but unlawful. Furthermore, your direct actions resulted in property damage and unnecessary distress. Your position as HOA president does not give you the right to trespass on private property, nor does it exempt you from the consequences of your actions. Karen opened her mouth to argue, but the judge held up a hand. I'm not finished. I'm granting the plaintiff's request for a permanent injunction. No member of the Whispering Pines HOA is permitted to enter or attempt to regulate Mr. Walker's property under any circumstances. Furthermore, I am awarding damages in the amount of $25,000 for property destruction and an additional $100,000 in punitive damages due to the HOA's continued pattern of harassment. I barely kept my face neutral as I glanced toward Karen, who had gone pale. But the judge wasn't done. Additionally, I am ordering that all legal fees incurred by Mr. Walker in pursuit of this case be paid in full by the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. That cost will not be passed on to the residents, but will be the responsibility of the board members who directly participated in these actions. That was the moment Karen knew she was finished. She started to argue, but her own lawyer tugged at her sleeve, shaking his head. She was beaten. Her little reign of suburban tyranny had officially come to an end. The court was adjourned, and the HOA board shuffled out of the room like a funeral procession, knowing they had not just lost a legal battle, but their authority, their reputations, and a whole lot of money. Jim clapped a hand on my shoulder as we watched them leave, shaking his head with a smirk. That went even better than I expected. But the fallout wasn't over. Within days, news of the lawsuit spread through Whispering Pines like wildfire. Residents were outraged. Not at me, but at their own HOA for dragging them into an expensive, pointless battle. Karen was forced to resign, along with half the board, after an emergency vote stripped them of their positions. The new board president, a much saner man named Tom Mitchell, called me personally to apologize. We had no idea things had gotten so bad, he admitted. Most of us moved here because we liked the quiet. We never meant for the HOA to turn into some kind of dictatorship. I listened, arms crossed, as he made his case, then surprised him by making an offer. You want to fix things? Then let's start fresh. Twice a year, I'll host an open house for the community. The kids can learn about ranching, maybe even feed the animals. We turn this mess into something positive. Tom was so shocked he didn't answer at first, then finally let out a breathy laugh. You serious? Completely. If people understand where their food comes from, maybe they won't be so quick to complain about the smell of cows. And just like that, the war ended not with more lawsuits, but with understanding. The HOA stopped its nonsense, and I got some unexpected customers. Families from Whispering Pines started buying my beef and eggs, kids from the neighborhood came to visit the ranch, and somewhere along the way, the battle lines blurred into something better. As for Karen, she packed up and moved a few months later, her house quietly listed for sale without a single mention of the community decorum she had once fought so hard to protect. Sometimes, the best way to win isn't just by beating your enemies, it's by turning their loss into something they never expected. And as I watched another batch of Whispering Pines kids feeding the chickens one warm summer afternoon, I had to admit, it was a pretty satisfying ending.